Hey there, it's Erin again. I feel like I'm always wearing striped shirts when I post these videos, but I just wanted to talk a little bit more about magical realism, as I promised in my first video. If you're not sure what magical realism is, go ahead and check that video out first. You can see that on my channel and also on my blog. But for those of you who are already in the know, let's get going. One thing I wanted to talk about today is magical realism when it kind of encounters the intersectionality of feminism. And when we sort of talk about feminism in terms of different cultures and claiming a space for each specific culture. Oddly enough, I'm going to open a feminist discussion with mentioning Italo Calvino and his magical realist work, The Baron in the Trees. So one thing that book sort of overtly explores through magical realism is this idea of having to get away from the world in order to see it clearly. So you have a character in that book that essentially just decides, you know what, screw this, and goes and lives in the trees. And everything else that happens in that book is a result of this sort of spatial choice that this character has made to not really be in heaven and above everybody, but not really be down on earth with everybody, but sort of in this what we call liminal space, or the in-betweenness. So you have all these really interesting points that the book makes and all these ideas that the book explores just through this idea of placing a character in this unlikely position that sort of overtly says, hey, this character has found himself between two worlds, essentially. And so one thing I think that's really interesting with using that book as sort of a catalyst to talk about magical realism and feminism and culture is the idea that many, so for example, when we talk about feminist writers coming from Latin America, a lot of them incorporate feminist elements. You have Isabel Allende with The House of Spirits. You have Dreaming Cuban by Cristina Garcia, which is a book that I read. If you saw my magical realism video, you know that I read that this semester in class. And something I think that is really important that has to do with that is the idea of kind of showing what it's like to be in between two sort of spaces culturally while you're writing a novel and making your point, whatever that is, and from a literary standpoint. And so one thing that was really interesting when Cristina Garcia came to speak to our class was how she was talking about the differences of growing up in Cuba versus being in sort of the Cuban diaspora, living in the United States in a place like New York City, where it's very much a mix of different cultures, a melting pot or a salad, however you want to. Probably a salad's a better metaphor because every individual culture is sort of maintaining a little bit of their autonomy and their own cultural stamps, but they're also sort of like intermingling and having to pass and sort of become American. There's this pressure to assimilate. And so one thing that Cristina Garcia articulated, and I know something that Isabel Allende covers quite a bit, is this idea of keeping your Latina-ness while sort of coming over into this new space where you're also an American. So you're becoming this new thing. You're not getting rid of the Latina in the person. You're just kind of like adding to it. And so what I think is really interesting and where magical realism comes in is this idea, like Italo Calvino explored in Baron in the Trees, is just kind of using a magical element to offset the fact that we're living in a reality, and that magical element gives us this idea that you're living in a reality, but it's this alternate space in a reality. And we know, coming from feminist theory, or at least those of you probably who have followed feminist theory, might understand that a lot of that has to do with claiming a space for oneself and finding oneself the outsider in what you can see as maybe just a patriarchal, white world where you have all of these different classes of people and all these different groups of people that have privilege that you may not have. And so it's really interesting when magical realism clashes with this, or not clashes, more like affects and weaves in and out, and it enhances this idea when writers use it in books. And I think part of the reason that we see that a lot coming from Latino writers, particularly those who have roots that are not from the United States originally, those who maybe have lived in different places, and the reason I think that that's so important to study is because of this idea that Gloria Anzaldúa, the feminist theorist, articulated in her book, Borderlands La Frontera, is that when you're coming from a different culture and you're encountering a new culture, you always feel like you're sort of in the middle, that liminal space, the barren in the trees. You know, you're that person who is not quite here with everybody else, you're not quite there back home, but you're in the middle. And so one thing that Anne Zeldua talks a lot about in her, I believe it's part of Borderlands, it's sort of an essay or chapter, it's called How to Tame a Wild Tongue, is really interesting because she sort of writes that in and out of Spanish and English, a little bit of Spanglish, and the whole point of that was this idea that when you move to a place, especially like the United States, a place that's dominated by whiteness, by patriarchy, by sort of when you do have feminists, a lot of the time you're talking about white feminists with sort of waspy leanings that typically, not all the time, but sometimes, more often than not, tend to forget about other cultures and voices that can get silenced by that movement. I mean, if you think back to Betty Friedan, even Simone de Beauvoir, any of the early white feminists, and early, I mean second wavers in the mid 20th century, a lot of times they would talk about the white experience, the white housewife, and the rich woman. They wouldn't really discuss women of color. They certainly wouldn't discuss the lavender menace of lesbian, trans women. That wasn't even like a thing that people wanted to discuss in the public sphere. So you're missing out on a lot of voices. And I think one thing that's really interesting about incorporating this magical realism into these sort of marginalized voices is that now you have this whole different way of looking at a story from someone who you might not identify with. And so I always mention my standpoint just because, especially as an academic, it's important to come right out and say, hey, I'm a white person who was born with quite a bit of privilege in sort of a middle-class family. I'm technically like a second generation American because my family's from Canada, but that really doesn't, give me too much insight on what a lot of people are thinking and feeling and experiencing. And so I come to the table with quite a bit of white privilege. And so when I'm looking at these stories that sort of discuss this liminal space, this in-betweenness between two cultures, it's really interesting to me because it helps me see things more clearly when we had this magical element interwoven. And so this is something that I kind of explored in the first video, but it's interesting to me that so many writers that have come to identify as maybe feminist writers, like for example, you have Toni Morrison, I mentioned Christina Garcia, Isabel Allende, you have these strong feminist messages, but they come in a package of this magical realism. So it comes to you in a way that maybe if you're coming from the privileged standpoint, and maybe if you haven't really given much thought to, oh, hey, I want to read a feminist book. If you're just a person wanting to read a novel, you're not going to necessarily go pick up a book that you know is going to be political and you know is going to be telling you something that might be clashing with your view or calling out your privilege or you're coming to the table to read. That's what a lot of us here on BookTube are doing. We're coming for entertainment. But when you get a story like this that tells it suddenly in a new way with this magical element that's just in there for the sake of defamiliarizing the whole situation and calling into question what the reader already thinks she knows, it's a really big help to social justice because it gives you that perspective in a little more of an authentic way. And for example, in the tradition of Latina writers specifically, you get this in a way that more accurately approximates what a lot of them grew up with, like their grandmothers telling them stories. And so you get this really interesting cultural sort of rhythm with it. And so I just wanted to share that again. Like I feel like it's a really powerful way to sort of bring your culture through and show somebody a new story in a new way. And as we all know, of course there's a lot of talk about, oh, well, books are dying. They're not. I mean, check out studies, look up the state of the book. But the reality is the book market is still pretty saturated, especially now that many of us have the means of production right at our fingertips. I mean, we can all just sign up for InDesign Creative Cloud for a month, bang out a design of our book, and then just be like, hey, it's on Amazon now, my book. It's out there. I didn't have to go through a publisher. I didn't have to go through the typical hierarchy, echelons, all that kind of stuff. Just woohoo, Marxism, it's there. So I can create now, and anyone can create. And books are coming in different forms. You can, I mean, it doesn't even have to be a typical book. It's just on the internet somewhere. And all of that is really important. And I think that when we're studying and trying to decide, like, okay, how do I want to tell my story in a way that stands out amid all of that, something like magical realism really helps, because even if you don't happen to come from a culture where your grandmother's telling a story and then all of a sudden somebody's a witch and we just gloss right over that, and that whole thing served to give you some sort of a metaphor or a different perspective on the story, or maybe deliver the meaning of the story to you a little more clearly. Even if you don't come from that specifically, there are still really interesting ways that you can go about conveying this. One of my favorite examples is a writer, Michelle Youngstone, wrote a book called Above Us, Only Sky. And in that book, you have a character that is just born inexplicably with wings, like an angel's wings. And this, of course, is reminiscent. There's Gabriel Garcia Marquez's story, which he's the big, like, 100 Years of Solitude. A lot of people consider him like the big guy in magical realism, which of course wouldn't be wrong, because I mean, if you read that book, it's just amazing, and it's a terrific example of the movement or genre or whatever you want to call it. But what's interesting about Michelle Youngstone's story is that it incorporates this idea of magical realism and sort of redirects it to give her own kind of feminist message. And I really like that idea of calling to attention the fact that, especially maybe a couple decades ago, there weren't so many women involved in this magical realism space in terms of like literary spaces. And so she's kind of gone and taken this and applied magical elements, the wings, to a story of sort of World War II Europe, which I thought was really interesting because there are so many books about World War II Europe, and I mean, I don't care if they're all the same. I'm still going to keep reading them because that's what I'm into. But at the same time, I thought that was really interesting to sort of borrow that that style and that idea to take a story that might have otherwise gotten lost and give it something unique and something beautiful. So in her story, it's essentially going back generations. We see that a lot with magical realism. We always talk about, just in pretty much every magical realist text I've read, it's, this is what's happening now, but then this is what my mother did, and this is what my grandmother did, and this is what my great-grandmother did. And then, of course, there's always someone in the background who nobody knows how old they are. So it's this whole idea of tracing through generations and telling a broad story with the magical element, mostly realist, that comes in to make a very large statement about something. And so in Michelle Youngstone's book, I think it was really interesting because she criticizes misogyny quite a bit in that book, especially when it comes to capturing and rapes on behalf of soldiers during World War II. I mean, you see that a lot, and of course any nation is guilty of that, but it calls to attention these misogynies, and it calls to attention the misogynies that are happening not only to the main character, who is contemporary with the reader right now, but also her great-grandmother, her grandmother, all of these people in her past, and it just tells so much of a richer story. So I just wanted to leave you with that. Some things to check out. Right now I'm reading Sit and Rock by Glenda Guest. It's another one that kind of talks a little bit about the woman question, I guess, as Simone de Beauvoir would put it. And then I mentioned this one in my last video, but Christina Garcia, Dreaming Cuban. The House of the Spirits, Isabel Allende, and then, of course, Michelle Youngstone, Above Us, Only Sky. And then, again, you can Google lists on good magical realist women writers, but it's definitely something, especially in academia, we don't see covered as much as the male greats, like as much as Rushdie or Marquez. So if you're in academia, I guess that's my challenge to you, and that's something that I'm currently working on, is a research project having to do with how magical realism serves feminism, because I believe it does in a variety of ways, and why it's underrepresented, and how we can fix that in academia. So my challenge to you is maybe, check them out. I mean, there's some good ones, there's some contemporary ones, there's some that you might not have even thought of. So do some digging, take a look around. If you're just a regular reader, a regular plain old reader, which, you know, I do part-time. I'm a regular plain old reader who reads sometimes awful stuff, but sometimes good stuff, just whatever I'm in the mood for. Do check it out. I mean, if you're new to magical realism and this is looking at my videos is the first time you've heard of it, go check it out. Give some a try. I mean, look at Toni Morrison. Of course, still look at Marquez and Rushdie because they're amazing. But yeah, like, especially if you're interested in feminism and social justice, a lot of these books really have underlying messages that make a pretty strong case for getting out there and promoting social justice. So anyway, I wanted to leave you with that, and I hope you have a fantastic day.